Welcome to Mathematics for Principles of Economics. The topic of this video is what is a reserve ratio?
And the math behind the economics is ratios.
So recall that banks and thrift institutions are required to keep a minimum percentage of their checkable deposits in reserve, and reserves can legally be held in a Federal Reserve Bank or in vault cash. So this percentage is called the reserve requirement or a reserve ratio, or sometimes a required reserve ratio. So why is this called a reserve ratio?
In order to understand the question, we have to know what ratios are. So ratios are just a mathematical way to compare two values. So what do we need in order to calculate a ratio? Well, all we need is two values. We'll call them A and B. And if we're given two values, A and B, the first thing we do is we write the values like this with a colon in between. That's the most common notation you'll see for ratios. You do sometimes see it as a fraction, but this is the most common notation. And then we'll reduce it to lowest terms if we can, if possible. And then we're going to write it as a percentage if we're asked. It'll be depending on the context. So let's do a quick calculation of ratios. We want to find the ratio of kids to cookies at some birthday party where there are 10 kids and there are 30 cookies. So the first thing we do is write 10 kids to 30 cookies as a ratio. That's step one. Step two is to reduce it to lowest terms. I can think of this ratio as 10 over 30. So if I reduced that to lowest terms, I'd have 1 to 3. And so here we have it reduced. And that means if I'm a kid at the party, I see one kid, I get 3 cookies. I can change that into a percentage of 33%.
Okay, let's answer the question about reserve ratios. It turns out that for most checkable deposits, banks and thrifts have to keep 10% in reserve. So this is called a ratio because it tells us how two numbers compare. And in this case, the two numbers we're talking about are the amount of deposits in checking accounts and the dollar amount of required reserves. So for every $10 in checking deposits, banks must keep $1 in required reserves. So talking about that as a ratio, the ratio of required reserves to deposits is then 1 to 10 or 10%. Other times we use ratios in economics. We talk about concentration ratios. We can think of productivity in terms of ratios, dependency ratios, affordability ratios, and so on.
So now we've seen how to use the math behind the economics to understand what a reserve ratio means. Thank you very much for listening.